cardboard moving boxes were stacked 3 high in the hallway of my Lakewood apartment. Their taped seams smelling of fresh cardboard and rain. It was nearly 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I had just hauled the heaviest trunk into the spare bedroom, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my forearm. Standing in the middle of my living room was Sophie Bennett, wearing a dark knit dress from her long day at the local community theater, clutching a glass of tap water like a life preserver. I pulled out my key ring, detaching the spare set to hand them over. Main lock, deadbolt, and the heavy brass one opens the street entrance, I said, setting them on the quartz kitchen counter between us. Sophie picked up the keys, her thumb tracing the smooth metal edges. Her posture relaxed by a fraction of an inch. "House rules?" she asked softly. "I have a short list," I offered smoothly. "Don't eat food marked with my blue tape. Ask before borrowing my audio gear. And if my bedroom door is closed, give it a firm knock first." Sophie nodded slowly. "Reasonable." I opened my mouth to add my standard phrase. "Friends are fine as long as you give me a heads up," when Sophie cut me off in a voice so quiet it barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. "Please don't bring anyone home." I froze mid-sentence, looking across the counter. "Anyone?" Sophie's spine went completely rigid. "I know that sounds unreasonable. Just forget I said it." She lifted her glass to take a sip, and that was the exact moment I looked down at her hands. Both of her hands were trembling so violently that the water inside her glass vibrated in sharp, erratic ripples. I didn't ask her why she was afraid. I didn't demand an explanation. "Okay," I said quietly, keeping my tone steady and calm. "No unexpected guests. If I ever want someone over, I'll ask you first." Sophie stared at me, her dark hazel eyes widening in disbelief. "That's it? You're not going to argue? Were you expecting paperwork?" I smiled gently. A breathless, watery laugh escaped her lips, her eyes glistening under the warm amber kitchen light. "My name is Daniel Carter. I am 35 years old, an audio editor, and when Sophie Bennett moved into my spare room that rainy Tuesday night, I knew almost nothing about her past. What I didn't know then was that 3 weeks later, Sophie would tell me the terrifying truth behind her shaking hands. Nor did I realize that the fastest way to win a woman's heart isn't by trying to save her. It's by proving that her boundaries will always be respected without her having to beg for them. For the first 7 days of our new living arrangement, Sophie and I moved around each other like two careful diplomats navigating a fragile peace treaty. At 7 in the morning, I would step into the hallway, find the bathroom door open, and say, "Free!" Sophie would glance out, her dark hair wrapped in a towel, and reply, "All yours, Dan." At 7 in the evening, I would walk into the kitchen, find her chopping vegetables, and pause at the threshold. "Mind if I use the stove?" Sophie would tilt her head, a faint, teasing spark dancing in her hazel eyes. "Are you seriously asking permission to enter your own kitchen, Daniel?" "I am adapting to local customs, Sophie," I would reply deadpan, pulling a skillet from the rack. Beneath our polite routines, I kept my promise with absolute discipline. On our second Friday together, my best friend, Michael, texted me asking to swing by and pick up an external hard drive for a documentary project. Instead of giving him my door code, I texted Sophie first. "Michael needs to grab a hard drive. He'll be in the hallway for 3 minutes. Is that okay with you?" Sitting on the sofa across the room, Sophie looked down at her glowing phone screen. She stared at my text message for 10 long seconds, her breath catching in her throat, before typing back, "Yes, thank you for asking." When Michael arrived, I didn't let him step past the entryway. I met him out in the carpeted hallway, handed him the drive, and closed the front door firmly behind me. Michael leaned against the wall, arching an eyebrow. "Is your new roommate secretly running an underground casino in there, Dan?" "She values her privacy, Mike," I said simply. "You're soft, Carter," Michael chuckled, patting my shoulder. From inside the kitchen, Sophie's voice drifted through the wooden door frame with crystal clarity. "I can hear you, Michael." Michael gasped in mock terror, backing toward the elevator. "I like her. She's terrifying." You don't live here, Mike, Sophie called back smoothly, a genuine laugh lacing her words. As the days turned into weeks, I began to understand why Sophie guarded her space so fiercely. For years prior, I had lived with an ex-girlfriend who believed cohabitation meant the total elimination of personal privacy. She routinely invited friends over without warning, rearranged my editing studio, and dismissed my need for quiet focus with a wave of her hand. Why do I have to ask? We lived together. When that relationship ended, the lesson I carved into my heart was simple. Living together does not erase the right to personal boundaries. Intimacy without consent isn't closeness. It's just intrusion. Sophie carried her own deeper scars. 2 years before moving to Lakewood, she had shared a downtown apartment with a roommate who hosted endless, unannounced parties. One night, an overgrown gathering spilled out of control, filled the narrow hallway with 30 intoxicated strangers, and blocked the main exit for hours. Sophie hadn't been physically harmed, but the terrifying experience of being trapped inside her own home, surrounded by people who held no respect for her safety, stripped away her sense of security. She didn't need a savior to fix her past. She just needed a home where her front door was a shield, not a sieve. And without realizing it, our small, quiet apartment was slowly becoming the safest place she had ever known. The true test of our domestic truce arrived during our 3rd week together, brought on by an emergency structural repair in our building's utility riser. A slow plumbing leak inside the central wall required the landlord to tear open a 4-foot section of plaster in our living room, rendering the main lounge area completely uninhabitable for 6 straight days. Because my editing desk normally sat near the living room window, I was forced to relocate my dual monitors, soundboard, and heavy mechanical keyboard onto the small wooden dining table in the kitchen nook. 2 hours later, Sophie walked out of her bedroom carrying her drafting board, scale rulers, and balsa wood models, stopping dead in her tracks at the kitchen threshold. The living room is officially a construction zone, Dan, she noted, looking at the plastic dust sheets covering the sofa. I have claimed the eastern half of the dining table, Sophie, I grunted, adjusting my heavy studio headphones around my neck. You may occupy the western sector. I require 40% of the tabletop for my theater scale models, she countered, setting her cutting mat down opposite my keyboard. 35%, I bargained deadpan. And you promise not to glue my mouse to the wood. No promises, Carter, she smirked, pulling out her wooden chair. For the next 4 days, forced proximity crammed our daily routines into a 10-foot radius of quartz countertops, coffee mugs, and tangled power cords. I learned that Sophie bit the metal ferrule of her pencil when she was struggling with an architectural elevation, and that she quietly talked to her tiny balsa wood chairs as if they were sentient beings. She learned that I pulled my wireless headphones down around my collar every single time she stood up, giving her my full, undivided attention even if she was just reaching for a glass of water. You keep making an extra cup of coffee at 2 in the afternoon, Dan, Sophie noted on Thursday, eyeing the steaming ceramic mug I set near her elbows. It is a complex medical condition, Sophie, I replied smoothly, turning back to my soundboard waves. My hands automatically brew 2 cups. You should see a specialist for that, she teased gently, cradling the warm mug between her palms. Too expensive, I grunted. Drink the coffee. On Friday evening, a severe winter gale slammed into Lakewood, knocking out the regional power grid and disabling the building's passenger elevator. Heavy snow rattled against the kitchen window pane, while amber candlelight cast flickering shadows across our shared table. Because the building's main intercom system was offline, maintenance workers occasionally knocked on hallway doors to deliver emergency updates. Every single time a heavy knock echoed down the corridor, I noticed how Sophie's shoulders locked into rigid lines. Before standing up to check the door, I made a point to speak clearly into the quiet room. Maintenance update, Sophie, I said softly, looking her straight in the eye. 2 workers in high visibility vests. I'm going to open the door 3 inches and talk to them right here. Sophie looked up from her scale model, her dark hazel eyes softening with profound relief. Thank you, Dan. She didn't need me to fight her battles. She just needed information, transparency, and the absolute predictability of a man who kept his word. By the second night of the blackout, the atmosphere inside our candlelit kitchen had transformed into a warm, delightfully intimate rhythm. I sat across from Sophie, attempting to heat a pot of pre-cooked chili over a portable camping stove I had dug out of my storage closet. "What is that smell, Dan?" Sophie asked, peering over her drafting board with an arched eyebrow. "This is executive culinary survival, Sophie," I declared, stirring the thick brown stew with a wooden spoon. "Be grateful. I am contemplating voluntary starvation," she teased, resting her chin in her hands. "You are free to decline your portion," I smirked, setting 2 bowls onto the wooden mat. "And let you eat all the protein?" she countered smoothly, grabbing a spoon. "Not a chance." She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and let out a soft sigh. "Okay, it's actually tolerable." "High praise from a woman who lives on almond butter and rice cakes," I noted, taking my seat across from her. Sophie let out a breathless laugh, her eyes sparkling under the soft golden candlelight. "You enjoy being completely insufferable, don't you, Carter?" "Only around people who think a camping stove is a safety hazard," I replied smoothly. As we finished our simple meal, Sophie reached across the small wooden table to grab an eraser, her knuckles lightly brushing against my forearm. I froze for a fraction of a second, my pulse suddenly spiking in my throat. Sophie didn't pull her hand back immediately. She looked up, her dark hazel eyes locking directly onto mine with an electric, unspoken intensity that made the quiet room feel instantly warmer. "Dan?" she murmured softly. "Yeah." "Why don't you ever invite people over?" she asked, her tone dropping all playful edge. "Even before I moved in, Michael told me you almost never host parties." I leaned back in my chair, wrapping my hands around my warm tea mug. "I like quiet spaces, Sophie. I spend 8 hours a day listening to audio tracks through heavy headphones. When I come home, I want my living room to feel like an exhale, not a stadium." Sophie stared at me, her silver thumb ring spinning slowly around her finger, a familiar habit when her mind was racing. "You really mean that, don't you? It's not just a rule you made up for me?" "I don't make up fake lifestyle rules, Sophie," I said softly, looking straight into her eyes. "I like knowing who is standing on the other side of my front door. And right now, I'm remarkably happy with the person standing inside it." A heavy, beautiful silence settled over the kitchen. Sophie's lips parted slightly, her breath catching in her throat as a faint blush crept up her cheeks under the dim candlelight. 2 nights later, after power was fully restored and the Thors finalized ceiling repairs in the living room, Sophie walked out of her bedroom wearing an elegant dark knit dress, carrying 2 silver earrings in her palm. She stopped near my drafting desk, smoothing the fabric over her hips. "Done? Left or right?" I kept my eyes fixed firmly on my audio monitor. "They both look fine." "You didn't even look, Carter," she noted, stepping into my personal space until I could smell the subtle scent of her jasmine perfume. "I am practicing professional boundary discipline," I answered deadpan, finally turning my chair around. The moment my eyes met hers, the sarcastic banter completely evaporated from my lungs. She looked breathtaking, sleek, elegant, and entirely radiant. "You have a face, Dan," she teased softly, leaning down slightly. "Do you actually think I look good tonight?" My pulse hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "That feels like an administrative trap, Bennett." "It's a simple observational question," she insisted, stepping an inch closer. "You look breathtaking, Sophie," I rasped, my voice dropping an octave as I looked straight into her dark hazel eyes. "You've looked breathtaking since the night you walked through that door with 20 cardboard boxes." Sophie went completely motionless, her breath catching softly in her throat. "Now go," I muttered, quickly turning back to my computer screen before my self-control evaporated completely. "You're going to be late for your theater board dinner." "Dan," she whispered softly. "Have fun at the theater, Bennett," I interrupted, typing random key commands on my keyboard to hide the sudden rise of heat on my neck. She stood there for 3 long seconds before quietly picking up her clutch bag and heading out the front door. By Friday evening, as we sat together on the plush living room sofa watching a classic black and white film, I realized a terrifying truth. I didn't want her to be just my roommate anymore. I wanted her to be my entire world. And that was the exact moment our quiet sanctuary was brought face to face with an inescapable reality. At 11 o'clock on Sunday evening, the bright glare of Sophie's laptop screen illuminated her end of the living room sofa as she sat rigidly against the cushions, her face pale, her fingers flying across her touchscreen. "Everything all right, Sophie?" I asked, setting my book down on the coffee table. Sophie slowly closed her laptop screen with a sharp, metallic snap, keeping her eyes fixed on the closed cover. That was an official executive offer notification from the Harbor City Arts Foundation. My chest tightened into a cold, hollow knot. Harbor City was a major cultural hub located over 1,900 kilometers away on the opposite side of the country. It's a 10-month lead scenic design residency for their main stage season, she added softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I have to give them my official decision within 24 hours. My old defensive habit flared up instantly, erecting an unshakable wall around my heart to protect myself from emotional disaster. "That's an extraordinary career leap, Sophie," I said smoothly, taking a deliberate step back toward the kitchen counter. "You should definitely accept it. You've worked your entire professional life for a main stage residency." Sophie slowly stood up from the sofa, turning her head to glare at me with sudden white-hot anger. "Wow, that took you exactly 3 seconds, Dan. 3 seconds to put on your polite, reasonable roommate voice and push me out the door. I am trying to be supportive of your career," I argued, raising my voice slightly over the quiet hum of the apartment. "You are protecting yourself," she countered, her voice shaking with raw emotion as she stepped right into my personal space. "You do this every single time things get slightly real or complicated, Dan. You hide behind being reasonable, so you never have to risk getting hurt." Her raw, accurate words knocked the wind right out of my lungs. I was using nobility as armor to avoid emotional vulnerability. "I didn't ask you if I should take the job, Dan," she cried out softly, tears glistening in her hazel eyes. "I asked myself if there was any reason for me to stay. I spent 3 weeks watching you check hallway locks, brew extra coffee, wait up for me until midnight, and look at me like I was the only woman in the room. And the second I might leave, you tell me to pack my bags." Tears stung my own eyes as her confession shattered my remaining defensive walls into dust. "I didn't check those hallway locks just because I'm a good roommate, Sophie," I choked out, my voice breaking completely as I grabbed both of her warm hands in mine. "I checked them because I love knowing you are safe inside my home. I brew extra coffee because I love watching you drink it. I wait up until midnight because this apartment feels empty until you walk through that front door." Sophie let out a half-sob, half-laugh, leaning her forehead against my chest as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Finally, a truth you didn't run away from." I reached up, cupped her warm face between my calloused hands, and looked straight into her hazel eyes. "The first night you moved in, you asked me not to bring anyone home, Sophie," I whispered into the narrow space between us. "I thought you were setting a strict house rule. Then I saw your hands shaking, and I realized you were just a terrified woman looking for a place where you could finally feel safe." Sophie sobbed quietly, squeezing my wrists with desperate force. "I wasn't afraid of you, Dan. I was afraid you'd become someone I trusted, and then I'd have something to lose all over again." "You're not going to lose me, Sophie," I promised, rough and true. "I am hopelessly, wildly in love with my roommate." I leaned down and kissed her, a deep, tender, electric kiss that wiped away weeks of roommate boundaries, unspoken longing, and cautious fear. When we finally pulled back, breathing heavily in the quiet room, her laptop speaker let out a sharp digital chime on the table with an automated reminder. Harbor City offer acceptance deadline. 23 hours remaining. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the domestic atmosphere inside our small kitchen had transformed completely. Sophie walked out of her bedroom wearing an elegant cream dress for a morning production meeting, and as I stood by the stove flipping pancakes, I turned around and stared at her. "You're staring again, Carter," she noted, a radiant, familiar smirk returning to her lips. "I am officially allowed to stare now, Bennett," I replied smoothly, handing her a fresh mug of coffee. "I have clearance." "We haven't established new house rules yet," she teased, taking a sip. "I vote for zero rules," I grunted, wrapping my arm around her waist and pulling her close for a soft morning kiss. Yet beneath our playful banter, the 24-hour countdown clock was ticking relentlessly in the background. Sitting at the kitchen table, my old habit tried to surface one last time. "If Harbor City is what you've worked for your whole life, Sophie, I still think you should consider it. I refuse to be the man who keeps you tethered to a Lakewood apartment." Sophie set her coffee mug down with a sharp clack against the quartz counter. "If you try to play the noble martyr one more time, Dan, I swear I will throw this hot coffee straight into your lap." I blinked, caught completely off guard. "I am trying to be unselfish. You are deciding for me again," she snapped, leaning across the table. "I am 31 years old. I am not asking for your permission to have a career, and I am not asking you to quit your editing firm and follow me. I am asking if you are brave enough to build a real plan with me. Don't push me away and call it love." Her raw words knocked the wind right out of my sails. She was entirely, undeniably right. "I am terrified, Sophie," I admitted softly, my voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I'm terrified that if you go 1,900 kilometers away, you'll build an amazing new life and realize you don't need a quiet audio editor back in Lakewood." Sophie reached out, taking both of my hands in hers and squeezing them tightly. "I don't need you to promise me that long distance will be easy, Dan. I need you to promise me that you won't retreat behind your walls the second things get complicated between us." We pulled out a yellow legal pad and sat down together at the kitchen island to map out a mature, realistic strategy for the 10-month residency. First, Sophie would accept the Harbor City contract because she had worked too hard for her career to throw it away out of fear, and I loved her ambition too much to let her sacrifice it for me. She agreed to negotiate a compressed production schedule with the foundation, granting her 3 weeks on site in Harbor City during main stage builds, followed by 1 full week of remote CAD design work from our Lakewood apartment every single month. Second, I committed to changing my own routines, officially negotiating a flexible remote arrangement with my documentary firm that allowed me to travel to Harbor City during her peak production weeks, whenever my audio editing schedule permitted. Third, Sophie decided to maintain her tenancy in our Lakewood apartment for the entire 10 months, keeping her room as her permanent primary home base, so she never felt like a guest in her own life. We established our core relationship rules. No saying "I'm fine" when something is actually bothering you. No making major life decisions for the other person out of guilt or fear. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening at 8 p.m. is an uncancelable 2-hour video date. And after 4 months, we'll evaluate the arrangement together with no endless limbo. At 5:31 p.m., 29 minutes before her official deadline, Sophie stood at the kitchen island with her phone in her hand, her finger hovering over the glowing blue accept offer button. She looked over at me, her hazel eyes filled with excitement and nerves. "If I press this, Dan, we're starting our real relationship with 1,900 kilometers between us." "I don't care about the kilometers, Sophie," I smiled softly, stepping up behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist and resting my chin on her shoulder. "I've been in love with you since the night you handed me a cup of water with shaking hands. Distance isn't going to stop us now." Sophie let out a breathless laugh, leaned back against my chest, and pressed accept. At 5:52 p.m., her phone chimed with an official confirmation email. Before she could speak, I unlocked my own cell phone and showed her my screen. An official airline booking confirmation for a round-trip ticket to Harbor City for her 4th week on site. Sophie stared at the screen in disbelief. "You booked a ticket before I even clicked accept? I'm trying a brand new lifestyle rule." I smirked, kissing her cheek softly, deciding before I'm 100% sure. 14 months later, Autumn leaves painted the streets of Lakewood in rich shades of amber and gold. 10 months of long distance hadn't been an effortless fairy tale. We dealt with delayed flights, spotty Wi-Fi connections, and exhausting 12-hour workdays. There was one painful week in month 4 when I had to cancel my trip to Harbor City due to an emergency documentary deadline, leaving Sophie deeply disappointed. In the past, my habit would have been to shut down, say I'm fine politely, and retreat behind my walls. But instead of hiding, I called her immediately, admitted how lonely and frustrated I felt, and booked a makeup flight for the following Friday. We learned that real commitment isn't about avoiding friction. It's about refusing to let fear make decisions for you. Sophie brilliantly completed her 10-month scenic design residency in Harbor City, negotiating a project-based consulting retainer with the Theater Foundation that allowed her to relocate her primary home office back to Lakewood full-time. Instead of staying in separate rooms, we decided to sign a brand new lease on a sunlit 2-bedroom place near the river, a space that belonged to both of us equally. On a crisp Friday evening, as we unpacked the final moving boxes in our new living room, a loud, unexpected knock echoed from the front door. Sophie paused, holding a heavy tape gun. She looked at the door, then looked over at me standing near the hallway. Instead of her shoulders locking in fear, a radiant, beautiful smile spread across her face. She walked over to the peephole, checked the hallway, and saw a delivery driver holding a large box. She opened the door, received the package with a warm thank you, closed the deadbolt firmly, and turned back to face me. "Look at you," I grinned, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I didn't even shake, Carter," she teased softly, setting the package down. I stepped across the room, reached into my canvas jacket pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophie froze, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as tears of pure joy filled her hazel eyes. 14 months ago, you moved into my apartment and asked me not to bring anyone home, I said, my voice thick with emotion as I opened the box to reveal a simple, stunning diamond ring. "Sophie Bennett, I want to bring someone home for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" Sophie burst into tears, throwing her arms around my neck and kissing me deeply right there among the moving boxes. "You can bring someone home now, Dan," she sobbed playfully against my lips. "Who?" I whispered, sliding the ring onto her finger. "Me." I spent years believing that keeping my distance was the best way to protect my quiet life. But what I learned from Sophie was that real safety isn't about building walls. It's about finding the one person worth opening the door for. What a beautiful, inspiring reminder that taking a chance on true love is always worth the courage it takes to speak up. Do you think Dan was right to respect Sophie's boundaries without interrogating her about her past? Or should he have pushed her to talk about her shaking hands much sooner? How can couples better navigate long-distance career opportunities without sacrificing their relationships or individual growth? We would love to hear your perspective and personal stories in the comments below. If this story brought joy to your heart today, please hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone special in your life.